Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming in today. And right now, I'm having a debate with National Royal. He is a self-described conservative socialist. And the topic that we have for our debate is: Did America win the battle, or did it win the war in Iraq? And so there's a difference between winning a war and winning a battle. You can win 1,000 battles and still, in a way, even if you technically win the war, still lose it in terms of geopolitics and in terms of regional affairs. Um, Iraq is not the case of Vietnam. In Vietnam, the United States, at every turn, beat the Viet Cong and beat, North Vietnamese forces who assisted them in pretty much every major engagement. But we still withdrew from Vietnam and then eventually did nothing as we saw, South Vietnam fall to North Vietnamese forces. The case of Iraq is different. The Iraq War, we absolutely destroyed the Ba'athist forces in Iraq and liberated the country from the tyranny of the National Socialists in that country. And from the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, a mass murderer, WMD user, genocide committing, police state ruling bully. Um, but of course, today it's obviously still one of America's most hotly contested conflicts. And we won the war. We were not chased out. We were not defeated by Ba'athist terrorism or Al Qaeda terrorists or ISIL terrorists or by Shia death squads funded by Iran. But there are those who still argue that, well, yes, we won the war, but did we really win it? Or did we just win a battle uh, in a fight against, international terrorists and despots? And so I'm here to argue that we won the war. National Royalist is here to argue that we just won the battle, but lost the greater war. So, National Royalist, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for hosting this debate.
No problem. Well, thank you for joining. I really do appreciate it. Um, so give us your opening statement. Just make it, 3 to 5 minutes on why you think the United States just won the battle, but not the war.
Okay. So, for my opening position, it is like we're both arguing from the point of view of America's perspective and what's good for its national security's interests. So, it's not an argument of whether America's good or bad or whether America should expand. The argument is instead among America's engagement, how has it helped it expand? How has it helped its influence? So that's more the debate it's focused on here. And I would say for the case of the Iraq War, while Iraq was an adversary of America, and anytime you have one less adversary, it's a good thing. The question is at what cost then? What could you have done instead? Because while America could defeat Iraq, like is Iraq today, it could be described as a quasi proxy state of Iran with a lot of Iranian influence there, both in terms of insurgencies and the government. So, while you could get rid of one adversary, you have this greater adversary in the region. And as much as you can say Iraq's bad or Saddam was bad, they did keep Iran in check. So you lost that buffer that now America has to spend all these resources to counter Iran. And the other is broadly with the axis of evil that Bush coined is out of all three countries in it, they're the main ones, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. North Korea got nuclear weapons while Bush was president. So if you were going to invade a country, North Korea would have been better because you actually would have stopped a much more serious WMD's program. So the point on North Korea and Iran, there's other points to make, and we'll get to it in the debate. But it's clear, wow, America could get rid of one of its adversaries, two of them it still has to deal with today. Two of them are an annoyance. One has nuclear weapons. The other, there's talks that they're going to get nuclear weapons. So, in the grand scheme of things, like the Iraq War was like a victory in the sense America won, but it wasn't a victory as far as long term foreign policy goals. Yeah,
All
so
right, and
that's
so I'm going
my
to counter that by saying that um, while North Korea is a real and pressing threat, and even then was a pressing threat, I think in the aftermath of 9/11, you had to look at who had directly attacked us. So Al Qaeda had attacked us. That's why we went into Afghanistan to remove Al Qaeda, to destroy them. And we did. The United States military did a marvelous job of essentially, caving in Al Qaeda and their support, the Taliban, a victory that's been squandered by the Biden administration. And so screw Biden for everything he's done. And then we had to look at, okay, we're in this fight against Islamist terrorists, who are aiding and abetting and supporting Islamist terrorists around the globe. One of them was Saddam Hussein. He supported the PLO, he supported Hamas, he supported the Islamic jihadist groups, and just Lord behold, some of these Islamic jihadist groups that he was supporting in Egypt actually did have ties to Al Qaeda. I mentioned this in a presentation that I did recently at college with regards to the Iraq War. Arguing that it was a justified conflict. And so when we look at what happened in the aftermath of Iraq, again, once again, the Democratic Party squandered the gains that had been made in Iraq. For the aftermath of Iraq was that the Ba'athist terrorists tried to essentially play a waiting game, hoping that the United States public would force a withdrawal. That did not happen. Al Qaeda tried the same thing. Al Qaeda actually, from 2006 to 2007, tried to either A, force the United States to quit by getting the public to want to force President Bush to withdraw, or actually have a military victory against the United States. They failed in both these regards. The United States left eventually, in the second term of President Obama's administration. And this then led to the chaos that we saw ensue afterwards. Terrorist groups that had been underground and hiding, um, you know, finally came out of the woodwork because the Americans were no longer there to stop them. And also the violence in Syria, from ISIL spilled over into Iraq. They found Iraq, it was a perfect opportunity, to expand. And the Iranians have certainly, taken advantage of that withdrawal that should not have happened. I remember Rick Perry, when he was running for the Republican nomination for the presidency, in 2000 for the Republican primary. He said, back in 2000, I don't know, I think it was in 2012, yeah, where he said that he would send troops back into Iraq, and people in the audience laughed at him. And at the time, I was not a neoconservative like I am now. I was a libertarian Republican, so I laughed at him. But, in the aftermath of what we saw happen with ISIL and, the Iranian influence, I realized, he was right. We should have gone back and in force. And that's why the Iranians are so engaged right now in trying to do damage to us in Iraq, and they're trying to pressure us to leave. I mean, there's even this, uh, there's groups that are trying to get us to leave right now. The fact of the matter is, though, is that Iran, yes, has considerable leverage now over the Iraqi government, but that does not mean, though, that the war wasn't good to fight or didn't have positive results for the United States. A Saddam Hussein in power would have been an existential threat to the United States and to NATO and to our other Arab allies and our ally Israel as well. And the fact of the matter is that I think that what happened in Iraq was a victory that was achieved, that once again the Democratic Party, and this is why I'll never be a Democrat, you know, essentially, squandered by not keeping or maintaining a strong troop presence in Iraq. At least the only thing Obama did right in Iraq was at least when ISIL was attacking, and nearly took over the country. At least President Obama sent in the Air Force, unlike President Biden, who, when the Taliban were attacking, did nothing until the very last minute. And by then, it was too late. So that would be my counter.
Okay, so it looks like we can start the debate. So, one question I would ask, and this may seem unrelated, but this will tie into the subject, is during the Cold War among like rapprochement with China and like easing tensions with them, developing diplomatic relations with China to counter the Soviet Union. This more occurred in the 70s under Nixon and Ford. What do you think of that? Do you think working with China was good because at the time they had Mao, and you can say a lot of negative things about Mao?
Well, how does this relate to Iraq?
Like,
What's the
I'll get
tie-in?
to it. I just wonder, do you think that was good foreign policy at the time, or it was a mistake to normalize relations with China?
Well, it was a different period. You had the Soviets at that time were the greater threat. So it was essentially an opportunity to try and weaken the Soviet Union by decoupling them from one of their biggest partners in Asia, which up till then had been the CCP. And the CCP and and the Soviet Union weren't sort of getting along. The Soviet Union expected the Chinese government to essentially follow Moscow's line. But Mao was like, well, no, we're going to do socialism with our Chinese characteristics. We're going to do it kind of our way. And of course, this strained tensions. And so, what Nixon was doing was trying to put the United States in a better advantage to win the Cold War. Um, I don't think that that was a bad thing to do at that time. I think that that was simply just realpolitik. That was an understanding that the Soviet Union is the greater threat, while China isn't at this moment. And I think that if the real effects with that of bringing the CCP into into the global community, um, the mistake that was made by the Clinton administration, for making them, giving them most favored trading status, and then bringing them, and making the shift in the 90s in which American manufacturing left America and then went to mainland China, and which enriched the regime under the idea that if we bring capitalism to China, that the regime will become moderate and that democracy will come. But the Chinese were like, well, we can take the benefits of capitalism, but we can still keep our authoritarianism.
Yeah, so I mentioned that because that was a case of dual containment, that when you had two adversaries, instead of going against both at once, because that would require a lot more effort, you can pit a weaker against the stronger. So they do some of the work in containing each other. You don't have to do it all. And I say that because in the case of Iraq and Iran, Iran's much larger. They have more influence. And even today, there's talks of them getting nuclear weapons. You even mentioned the influence that they have in Iraq. So do you think it would have been better if there was a buffer right next to them? Because Saddam did go to war with Iran. He wasn't friends with them. It's not like he would work with them against America. Do you think America could have used Saddam against Iran to limit their influence?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Saddam Hussein was an enemy of the United States. The policy of the Reagan administration, which is why Donald Rumsfeld went to Iraq, was in the hopes that by talking with Saddam Hussein, there might be, a peaceful solution. The Ba'athist regime, by having a sort of at least a working relationship with the United States, might be more moderate and might not be as extreme, and might bring in, the policy of essentially, well, if you bring capitalism, if we try to have a talking relationship with people, then that will moderate them and that will make them less authoritarian, sorry. And you have to remember too that Iran had held Americans hostage, the Iran, hostage crisis, during the Carter administration. And so the policy of the United States was not to be friends with Iraq. They weren't friends with Iraq. That it was simply to ensure that neither side won. Because if Iran won, that would mean crazy Islamists, who would essentially start a global jihad. And once they got into Iraq, then what would stop them from going anywhere else they wanted? you know um and then it was obviously to contain Saddam Hussein, because they didn't want this megalomaniac tyrant to essentially occupy a part of Persia and win the war, and then be seen by the Arab world as the essentially the new leader of a Baathist rebirth and of a neo-Babylonian empire. And all Arabs to look at him and then say, oh my gosh, he is the defender of Arab nationalism and stuff like that, and he's been victorious against our historical enemy, the Persians. So if you look at it that way, and you understand that, look, Saddam Hussein also then after that went to war against Kuwait. And there was nothing really about going to war with Kuwait except a desire to take territory and expand his domain. And because, he felt jilted that, hey, I fought this war against the Persians, and you Kuwaitis, help supply me financially. You should be forgiving my war debts because I essentially fought for you guys. The Kuwaitis were like, well, we're not canceling your debts. You still owe us. And then obviously, Saddam Hussein also accused them of trying to siphon off oil, that was in Iraqi territory that wasn't really theirs. But of course, these were pretexts to invade Kuwait. And of course, he occupied the country. It was a brutal occupation. And, if he had any desire to work with the international community, he would have left when the United States gave him the opportunity. They gave him the opportunity for peace and he chose war. And it's the same thing in the 90s. He tried to assassinate a former US president. Remember George Bush Sr. was going to Kuwait in 1993, uh, and the Saddam Hussein tried to get his security forces to plot an assassination attempt. It was discovered in the spring of 1933, and thankfully did not happen. But how mad do you have to be that you literally try to assassinate a former U.S. president, and still engage in aggressive actions? You won't cooperate with the UN Security Council for inspection of your weapons and such like that. And so, no, he couldn't have become one of those, like, assets, because it was all about Saddam Hussein. It was all in it for himself. It was all in it for him because he saw himself again as the fulfillment of the Ba'athist ideology, and that he would bring about an Arab rebirth under his rule, and that he was essentially going to bring about a sort of neo-Babylonian empire.
Yeah. But like would you say that among Iraq and Iran, Iran's far larger and has more influence? So if you're trying to contain both, like instead of spending all this money and resources to contain both at once, if they're both pitted against each other and you work with the weaker, doesn't it make it easier? Because then after Iran, once that's contained, well, now you can contain Iraq, and now it's easier for you to contain Iraq.
Well, that wouldn't have been possible because Saddam Hussein was an existential threat to the US, and so is the Iranian government. The Ayatollahs are opposed to the US. They hate the US as much as Saddam Hussein did. The position that our Arab allies had at the time was, don't do the invasion because we need Saddam as a buffer to the Iranians. But that ignores all the terrible crimes that he was committing, the human rights abuses, that were extreme. I mean, the guy literally did something that no regime since World War II, Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan, had done, which was to use chemical weapons on their own civilian populations. They so this is the like for so this guy was totally mad and insane and diabolically evil, and it's just it's not right to it's not sensible to think that we should use this guy as a buffer, because what you're doing essentially is saying that, oh, we're going to back this one guy. That's why the Reagan administration and Donald Rumsfeld did not back Saddam fully. They gave him some satellite images, just to prevent the Iranians from winning. But they didn't give him, weapons and stuff like that. The Iraqi government bought most of their weaponry from the Soviets. They got that. That was their biggest supplier of weapons and stuff like that. And then the French also too, sold them stuff that helped them make chemical weapons. So it was so the the policy. Needs to, with Saddam Hussein in the 2000s, was had to be different, because especially in the aftermath of 9/11, in which Saddam Hussein was a tyrant who supported Islamist terrorist groups throughout the Middle East, doing damage to our allies and our friends, and indirectly doing damage to us. And so this was a part of the global fight against despots and against terrorists. And so this it was a to say that we should have taken the perspective by some of the Arab leaders there. Well, he's a buffer. It's like this, I don't agree with the maxim better the devil you know than the devil you don't. I think at the end of the day, they're still both devils. It's like saying, what would you rather have, an alligator or a crocodile? I mean, at the end of the day, they're both still going to try to eat you.
Well, like the point is, like long term, you would try to contain both, so it's not an endorsement of one. And even you said with Mao Zedong, and out of all estimates, like among like deaths by leaders, Mao Zedong has the highest by far. He has higher than Stalin and Hitler. Yet you say working with Mao was fine because you can keep in mind the context of a grander threat. You don't just say, well, Mao Zedong bad, or this one story about how a famine occurred here, or he was this evil guy. You realize net wise, the goal is you have to contain all your adversaries. You can't just go after Mao because as much as you want to focus on him, there's other people out there that are trying to undermine America. And I view it similar in the Middle East where you can make a moralization of well, Saddam bad, but you're net wise trying to contain all your adversaries in the Middle East. And while you can get rid of one, now like you have to deal with Iran, and Iran's more influential. Iran's far larger than Iraq, so like wouldn't you say a buffer's better if you net wise want to contain both?
No, I don't think so. Here's the difference. So we didn't work with Mao. That's not the correct perspective. I think that you should read a book by, and I hesitate to say his name because he's a paleoconservative, Patrick Buchanan. He wrote a book um, on the Nixon administration, and I'm actually going to look it up so I can talk about it, because he talked about his time essentially with the administration. And the reality was is that the we did not work with Mao, so that's an incorrect perspective to have. What we did was is that we worked on decoupling Mao from the Soviet Union. Because the divide was already there. It's not like we had created it. It was already there. But what we did was we essentially exacerbated those ties, sorry, those divisions. So that way, um, we could ensure that the regime, the Soviets, would lose one of their partners and weaken them internationally. You know, and I don't know if the Nixon administration at the time was aware of the great famines and all the deprivations that were committed by Mao. Reading in the book, Buchanan, admits that they knew that Mao was an authoritarian and a despot. They talked about, that in the book. The goal, though, was to weaken the position of the Soviet Union, not necessarily be friends and buddies with China. So it's not like I think it's different than you try to portray it as.
Well, it's not like a friendship, but it's still working with Mao. It's not trying to undermine Mao. Like, so the point is, you still are helping him out, and and I'm making a similar case for what could have been done in the Middle East. Is that you have a buffer against Iran? The buffer's weaker than Iran, so you can use that buffer against Iran because net wise, if you get rid of Iran first, then you get rid of Iraq later. That takes less effort than trying to get rid of both at the same time, or America having to go against both. If you can use one against the other, that makes your work easier in containing both.
Well, that's what happened in the 80s. I mean, Iran, the Reagan administration had a policy of we don't want Iraq to win and we don't want Iran to win. And so at the end of the day, neither of them won. They um but you're kind of trying to suggest that trying to weaken one foe and work for another is the best solution, and sometimes it is. There are times, I guess, in the real politic in which you sometimes work with unsavory characters to help bring down an even more unsavory character. However, that does not mean that you should do that in every context. Okay, sometimes there are actors that are just so bad that there's another actor that's just as worse than them, but that doesn't mean you should work with them. I mean, it's kind of like saying, like, well, I'd rather support the Green Goblin over, the Joker because at least the Green Goblin is a bit smarter, or a bit more rational. No, they're both at the end of the day evil. And I think the United States had understood that. That's why Bush understood. That's why Bush was right in that, the United States could no longer uh, deal with the isolation of the Clinton administration, who had tried to separate themselves from foreign affairs and only got involved at certain times. They ignored the Rwandan genocide, and then because of the political fallback of that, they then supported the NATO, United Nations mission in Serbia, Bosnia, to to stop the genocide over there. Um, and so we have to understand that with like I made my point earlier, you know the maxim or the idea that better to work with the devil than the devil you don't know. I don't think that always works in every context, because if we had, let's say, we had not uh, gone into Iraq and allowed Saddam Hussein to stay in power, I have no doubt in my mind that he would have regrouped his strength and started another conflict or another war, or engaged in more supporting terrorist activities throughout the world. I mean, let's not forget the Iran-Iraq war. He lost there was 1 million people who died on the Iranian and the Iraqi side in that war. And then just, about 2 years later, then he started the Iran-Kuwait war. He went into the Kuwait, and which led to the first Iraq war, or as it's known, the Gulf War. And then of course, the Highway of Death, in which his military forces were absolutely routed, and it was no longer just a retreat; it was a full-on slaughter fest, because the Iraqi Air Force had been destroyed, and they provided no cover to their troops who were retreating. And so it considerably weakened Hussein's position in the region. But he then just switched over to supporting Islamist terrorist groups, like we've mentioned earlier, as a way of, replacing the fact that he had lost, so many troops. And I think that at the end of the day, that what Saddam Hussein would have done was he just simply would have regained his strength and done something more bad, because Saddam Hussein, again, this guy had committed genocide. He had used WMDs in 2 wars. He used WMDs. Sorry, in one war. Sorry, he used it in the Iran-Iraq war, and then he used it a second time against a civilian population when they were putting down, Kurdish resistance groups. And I I just don't see. I just can't buy the maxim that that what you're kind of putting forward, which is better the devil you know than the devil you don't, because it's like, what's the difference between a crocodile and alligator? The crocodile's bigger, and the alligators, but the alligator will still eat you nonetheless.
Well, the goal is that you're going to contain both in the long run. So, like, you use Iraq insofar as Iran's a greater threat. But if that changes where Iran becomes weaker or the government changes in Iran, now you're going to have to rethink your strategy where now you can go after Iraq. You can contain them to full strength. So, the point is when you have two adversaries, you can work with the weaker against the stronger, and then later, once you get rid of the stronger, you can go against the weaker. So, like in the case of working with Saddam, it would only be temporary. It's not like you would just keep him in until, and his government would live on until the end of time. And as much as like you can say, well, Saddam did this, Saddam did that, like what about Iran today? There's talks of Iran getting a nuclear weapon, like which you would say is a concern. Iran, you even said they have influence in Iraq now. Iran, they have influence in their region, like funding proxy wars. So, like, wouldn't you say, as much as you can criticize Saddam, Iran's has a much greater presence in the region?
Iran does have a presence in the region, but that's something that they've nurtured for decades. It's not something that just emerged out of the Iraq conflict, the Second Iraq War. It was something that they'd nurtured for years. I mean, they'd already had their claws, uh, in Lebanon and in Syria. I mean, the 80s. There was the Lebanon Civil War, because of the Syrian influence, and the Syrians became very close to the Iranians. And today, Syria, even though it's ruled by a Baathist despot, and Baathism is an Arab National Socialist ideology of pan-Arab unity. I mean, they're still today a proxy essentially of the Iranians. I mean, the Iranians essentially help bankroll them, and the Iranians essentially help support their regime, their troops, and stuff like that. Through Hezbollah and other different militant, Shia Islamist groups. So it's not like that just happened or came out of nowhere. I think the fact of the matter is that, see, Iran has been doing this for a long time, and they would have kept doing it, even had Saddam Hussein been in power. It was critical to remove Saddam Hussein because he was a real pressing threat. Um, the idea is, well, we need we need we need Saddam Hussein to counter the Ayatollahs, but the fact of the matter is that the Saddam Hussein was just as bad, you know, and the Ayatollahs were evil. It's like literally, pick your poison, and I'd rather drink no poison. I would rather have an Iraq that is, free and democratic, and giving people a say in their futures, and people are free to do what they want. Obviously, the Iranians have taken advantage of America's lack of presence in Iraq now, and that's why they put their claws in the government through the Dawa Party. And for anyone who doesn't know what the Dawa Party is, the Dawa Party is an Iranian, it's a pro-Iranian terrorist group, or at least was a terrorist group. Now they've got actual government ministers and stuff like that, and they're now in the government of Iraq, and they're extremely Sharia oriented, and they've tried to make laws against women, against LGBT people, against Christians and other groups. And so the threat is obviously real. The way you prevent that is by staying the course, staying the course and staying on the right. The problem is that with the election, with President Barack Obama, he held off. He never should have withdrawn from Iraq. He never should have left. He should have stayed, but the unfortunate thing is that he did, and as a result, this then opened the door to the Iranians to come in. And this is why, when you have an intervention, you have to stick it through, to the end. If we had done the same thing, if we had left Germany, during the Eisenhower administration, then, what would have happened? Well, the Soviets then would have then from East Germany then would have had huge influence in West Germany and might have, uh, you know, done the same thing that we saw in Iraq, post the American withdrawal, or done the same thing in Japan, or in Italy. So it's a matter of understanding that where the realm of alternate history is fun to consider, but that's all it is. It's just speculation.
Like, well, the main point of saying what could have been done better is to inform on future decisions to not repeat the same mistake, which can be actualized. But you were saying, like, oh, just counter Iran in addition. But that requires a lot of effort for America alone to counter both Iraq and then later counter both Iran. But if you can use one as a buffer against the other, like let's say in 2003, instead of Bush invading Iraq, he invaded Iran, and Iraq was a part of the coalition, and then maybe 10 years after the war, now the US is containing Iraq in the region. That would have been easier because Iraq's less of an influence in the region, and Iran, like, which is a greater threat, was removed, and it was easier to get rid of because you actually had an ally. You didn't, it's not like now where it's pretty much America and like Israel trying to contain Iran, and like that's it. Like you would say, if you're trying to get rid of both, America going against both is a lot harder than if you can use both against each other.
Well, if that had happened, I don't think Saddam Hussein certainly would have helped the U.S. Perhaps he would have, as sort of a, but nothing, but not out of good means. It would have been out of simply, means of potentially expanding, his territorial influence and stuff like that. And I don't like this idea of making deals with the devil. Okay, we tried that in World War II where we made a deal with the Soviets, and then look what happened to Eastern Europe, and that was under their, despotic dictatorship, for a very long time. I would have preferred the United States had, defeated, and then Great Britain and the Allies had beaten Nazi Germany, and then a few years down the line had then turned on the Soviets before they got nukes and then destroyed them. But that's alternate history. Same thing with your idea that, well, if we'd gone to war in Iran, and the Iraq, we could have used the Ba'athist as a potential ally of convenience, and that's alternate history. Maybe or not, maybe not. Um, and I don't think I do believe that there's more than just the United States and Israel that is countering Iranian influence. It's also the Saudis. The Saudis are fighting Houthi terrorists in Yemen, and so they're trying to essentially prevent an Iranian takeover of Yemen. And I commend them for their fight against uh, Houthi terrorism that's funded and supported and aided and abetted by Iran. And I take the position that, yeah, it's harder to uh, you know fight two front wars or fight two big enemies at the same time. Like I said, when my position would have been to, if it World War II, would have been to first focus on Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, and then take a rest, and then a few years later take down the Soviets. I'm not a fan because the problem is that I'm not a fan always of working with those sort with unsavory characters. Sometimes you have to, and sometimes you should, um, for the greater good. But sometimes it ends up not being the right decision to make. Because look, I sometimes yes, sometimes you have to work with unsavory people, but I don't agree with the maxim better the devil you know than the devil you don't. Sometimes because they're both devils at the end of the day.
Well, in the case of World War II, like I mean, in terms of the Soviets working with the Allies, that made sense because the Soviets like were a lesser threat than the Germans were, and even you said turn on them a few years afterwards, like that was literally the Cold War, and in the end, the Western powers managed to defeat both. It's just that the Axis was right away in the 40s. However, the defeat for the Soviets came in the 90s, and precisely because the Axis and the Soviets were fighting each other, they both weaken each other versus if let's say they grouped together and they all teamed up against the Western powers, that would have been a lot harder. So at the time in 41, if people said, well, Stalin bad, or what about the Holodomor, or what about like all these people Stalin negatively affected, if that had been the approach, like then it would have been harder to defeat both the Axis and the Soviets rather than working with one against the other. And I'm saying now, in the case of Iraq and Iran, if you just hyper focus on the weaker and you defeat the weaker, and now you have to go against the stronger all on your own instead of getting a potential ally that you could have used only to go against the weaker, you're just making it harder for yourself when you don't have to.
I don't know if I agree with that perspective all the time. You know, I mean, look, it was obvious that once you know World War II, once the Nazis tore up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invaded the Soviet Union. Um, I don't think that the West necessarily was inclined to make a deal with Stalin, and bring him into the Allies. I mean, at the end of the day, if they go to war, if two bad guys decide to go to war with each other and destroy each other, heck, I'm not going to complain. Let them destroy each other, and we'll finish off who's ever left at the end. You know, um, same thing in the case of the Iran, Iraq, or the Ayatollah Saddam Hussein rivalry. That's why in the Iran-Iraq war, we just made sure that nobody won. We gave Saddam Hussein only some satellite imaging photos. When the Iranians looked like they might win, so as to prevent an Iraqi collapse. But that was it. The position of the Reagan administration was to try and to prevent either side from winning, and by sending Donald Rumsfeld to Baghdad to meet with Saddam Hussein, it was in the hope that they could promote peace and in the hope that they might moderate the regime. And that didn't work out. Saddam Hussein decided to go to war with the United States and a whole Arab coalition and a global coalition in what he called the mother of all battles, rather than withdraw from Kuwait. And then he tried to plan an assassination for a former U.S. president, George Bush Sr. And then, rather than peacefully um, get some, rather than peacefully uh, release power, because there were talks about that the Russians talked about, which was to, maybe send Saddam Hussein to a place like Egypt or Jordan, in which he would be deposed from power and have no more rule, and essentially Iraq would transition away from his Ba'athist authoritarian, tyrannical, genocidal, maniacal, warmongering regime to a democratic one, but he refused. So it's your your position is only viable and feasible if there's a rational actor involved, and Saddam Hussein was not a rational actor.
But like the point is like you can say rational actor, but the U.S. like worked with Stalin against Hitler, and even a few years afterwards with the Cold War, it wasn't like a big celebration where both sides really got along in terms of the Allies. They turned against each other right away. So I'm saying that can be a similar thing where the U.S. works with Iraq against Iran, and it's not that Iraq like needs to like be a US puppet or needs to do all these things, but just it serves a useful role. And then once Iran's either weaker, once their government changes, once there's a major change that happens that now Iraq's the greater threat, then you can turn against them, similar to World War II and the Cold War. It's not like they were that far apart, and then now your goal is to contain Iraq. And if you do that net wise, it's easier to contain both than if you just hyper focus on Iraq. And guess what? Now there's talks of Iran getting nuclear weapons. You've admitted to all the influence, and you can say, "Oh, just stay there." But why go through all this effort when you can use one side against the other, when you can have them do part of the work in containing each other, rather than you having to spend all this money and like perhaps relying on Israel and Saudi Arabia, but that's about it, and containing Iran. Like, why go through all?
No, well, no, because because you try to make it as a point of, well, this is a rational actor that we can potentially work with, an unsavory actor, but a at least somewhat rational one. That Saddam Hussein was not rational. You have a guy who literally tried to commit genocide, ethnic cleansing against the Kurds. He tried to, commit a cultural genocide with physical persecution uh, against Assyrian Christians. During the 70s, he had essentially, organized and engaged in pogroms of the Jewish Iraqi community. Um, and he also engaged in two wars of conquest against his neighbors. I mean, I think he tried to assassinate also a former U.S. president, George W. Bush Sr. in 1993. I mean, how insane do you have to be that you actually try to murder, or at least plan the murder of, a former head of state of the United States? I mean, not even the most evil actor who's still rational would even consider that. I mean, that should just show you how mad the man really was. And so there's just you your s- your idea is based off of a premise that he was rational, at least a unsavory character, but at least a rational one,
Well,
and
I'm
that's
not
just
saying
not the
fully
case.
rational. I'm just saying rational enough that there's common interest, and even like if Saddam was a simpleton, he could realize there's enough interest to at least work with the US. That's what I'm saying. Like he was rational enough, not that like he was rational or a great guy.
Well, I know you've admitted that Saddam Hussein wasn't a good person. He was an awful person. What you have suggested though is that he was at least rational enough to think about, think about his long-term interests, but that's not true. Saddam Hussein literally should have known, for example, in the Gulf War, the first Iraq War, that there was no way his military could stand up to the might of the United States, the Arab coalition, and all these other different nations that were essentially against him. And he decided that, well, he was going to take them all on, which was a very stupid idea. And the Iran-Iraq War too showed his idiocy as well. He kept bungling and getting involved with his generals' orders and strategies, and as a result, they defeated and pushed out of Iran and pushed into Iraq. And so this idea, and also he wrecked the Iraqi economy. He chose to let everyone starve rather than let UN's weapons inspectors go into his facilities unabated, or check to ensure that Iraq had fully dismantled all their WMDs. And instead of doing that, he'd rather see people starve in the street. And meanwhile, they're starving. He's building 50 something palaces and tons of mosques, to essentially propagate his regime. So it's it just doesn't work, your argument. I'm sorry.
But like for the point, you can like keep saying like Saddam bad and find like historical examples of that. But the U.S. worked with Stalin and Mao, and both Stalin and Mao individually they had a higher death count than Hitler. Yet, did that stop the U.S. from like understanding to work with the weaker adversary against the stronger adversary, or did the West try going against both the Axis and the Soviets at one point? or did the West try going against both China and the Soviet Union at one point? No, just because like a leader is like awful, that doesn't mean you can't work with them. Because as much as you can say Saddam bad, the Iraq War did help out Iran, because you even said there's Iranian influence there. You can say, oh, the US should have still stayed, but you now have to put in all this effort rather than have a buffer against Iran, contain Iran. And once the question of Iran solved, now you can contain Iraq, which is much easier than Iran. It requires less involvement to contain them. And then in the grand scheme of things, containing both was easier rather than this approach of, well, Saddam bad. And then guess what? Now there's talks of Iran getting nuclear weapons. So how did that go?
So again, with the case of Stalin, you know, eh, with the United States, I've already said that I don't think that the Allies should have even brought the Soviet Union into the Allies. I think they should have
Why
just let
not? They were directly attacked by the Axis. They would have been a
because they
natural
were
ally.
because they were still, because Stalin and Hitler are literally different only by degrees. That's why they were still both evil.
But one
And
was a lesser threat to the West.
one was not a lesser threat. One actually one what became a real threat to the West. That's why we had the Cold War. And had
Yeah, so
Stalin lived a little
that's
long,
my point, that you can turn against them
but
right
well,
after. It's
national,
not like
don't
you get
interrupt me
along.
because national interest royalists, don't interrupt me, please. And um, also, with regards to Mao, again, it's not like the United States worked with him, okay? The Nixon administration did not come buddy buddies. It simply helped foster the divide between the Soviet Union and the CCP because it was trying to win the Cold War, and that was not a partnership or an alliance between the United States and China. It was simply, working to decouple China from the Soviet Union in order to help weaken the Soviet Union's position. And, again, I don't know if, again, I've already talked about how Patrick Buchanan, wrote in his book, that I've already put in the chat, Nixon's White House Wars, in which, and I hate to cite him because he's a paleocon job, but, he talked about how when he worked with the administration, they knew that, Mao was a pretty despot and not a good man and probably a nasty person. But that doesn't mean they knew the extent of what he had done in terms of the Cultural Revolution, in terms of the huge famines and genocide that occurred. You know, um, I don't know, and also to your point, that well, we could have done a similar thing in Iran and Iraq by instead of going into Iraq, invading Iran, and using the Iraqis or Saddam Hussein as an ally to, liberate the country. But then we would have been in a position where, the isolationists then would have said, "Oh, we need to leave Iran," and then we would have left, and then, well, who would have left? Who would have been left in the region to take it over, or at least, extend their influence? Saddam Hussein. It was really a case of it's not so that's what it's really a case of. You've got to you choose your enemies, and you choose or not choose your enemies because both Iran and Iraq were our United States enemies at the time, but it's a matter of choosing who you're going to fight first.
Yeah, and I would say fight the one that's stronger. And like you can say, like there always will be isolationists that try to undermine any war effort, but the point is containing Iran with Iraq as a buffer is easier than containing
Hold on,
Iran now.
National Royal. We're just about to hit the 1 hour mark, so uh, give us your closing thoughts in about 2 minutes, and then we'll start to close.
Okay, I'll give my like closing thoughts. So like, and I can continue what I was gonna say. So in terms of containing Iran, like let's just wind back to 2003. It would have been easier than now if you had Iraq as a buffer. Like there could be proposals of just contain them, invade them. There's all types of strategies you can use. But once Iran becomes a weaker threat, or their government changes, or there's a major development, then you can turn against Iraq. It's not like you have to be best buddies with them. You can turn against them right after. And if you do that, net wise, it's easier to contain both than if you just invade Iraq. That benefits Iran, and then now you have to deal with the mess of Iran. And this is just on the Middle East alone. Like, there's also the point that containing the axis of evil broadly, out of all countries in their chemical weapons program, while all three did have some type of chemical weapons program or WMD's program, North Korea actually got nuclear weapons. Iran, they're on their way to get them. We don't know whether they will. Iraq, it was hyped up as far as their chemical weapons program. There was some, but it was definitely hyped up. But North Korea actually got nukes. Yet this was while Bush was president, while Bush was saying we're going to contain like rogue states, we're going to contain like all these bad guys. And you can say Saddam's bad, but that's what happens when you hyper focus. You can't contain your enemies in the grand scheme of things, or if you do, it requires far more effort than it actually should. So that's my case there for foreign policy realism. Work with a weaker adversary against a stronger adversary. Don't try to go against both unless you have to.
Well, thank you, National Royalists, for your positions and airing them here. I would disagree. I think that, it was important for the Bush administration to fight the good fight in Iraq and remove a maniacal, despotic, tyrannical, genocidal, homicidal, WMD using capricious bully. And it was the right fight. And obviously, the Bush administration, was doing its ample best to fight terrorism and despotism. Unfortunately, it did not succeed everywhere, as in the case of North Korea. Uh, However, I do say that while I vehemently disagree with your position, National Royalist, I do want to thank you for coming on and airing them. And I do appreciate the conversation that we've had.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for hosting this.
No problem. So we're going to close out here, everyone, since we're about to hit the hour mark. I want to thank all the viewers who have come and tuned in. I want to thank the listeners for listening to this debate and hearing what the speakers have to say. If you want to support my work, please go to my Ko-Fi or my Cash App. You can please follow me on YouTube, Twitch, D Live. Ask me questions on Curious Cat if you have them. You can also see what I'm reading on Goodreads. Go to my Steam, see what games I'm playing. I'm even trying to get active on Gab. Anyway, everyone, thank you all for coming. Have a great night. Neocon action and V for victory.